At 67, after 40 years stitching other people's happiness into fabric, I never thought the deepest cut would come from my own family. The morning of my son's wedding, I ironed my best navy dress, never imagining that by nightfall, I would no longer be part of his life's design. At 67, after 40 years stitching other people's happiness into fabric, I never thought the deepest cut would come from my own family. The morning of my son's wedding, I ironed my best navy dress, never imagining that by nightfall, I would no longer be part of his life's design. That Saturday morning, I woke up before the sun, the way I had every day since Charles, my husband, passed away 15 years ago. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that hums when the world still sleeps. I brewed a pot of coffee, the smell filling my little kitchen on Magnolia Street. On the table lay my navy blue dress, pressed, neat, and waiting. I'd bought it 3 months earlier, after saving a little from each sewing order. I wanted something elegant but simple, something that said, I raised a good man, and today he's getting married. The wedding was everything I had worked toward for 32 years. My son, Daniel Carter, my pride and only child, was marrying Vanessa Moore, a beautiful young woman from Buckhead, whose parents owned a real estate company. They were good people, I told myself, maybe a bit polished for my Southside manners, but kind enough. I had stitched their curtains last spring as a favor. They paid promptly and said polite things about my craft. I took that as a good sign. That morning, I fixed my hair the way Charles used to like, soft curls around the face, and put on the pearl earrings that had belonged to my mother. As I slipped on my shoes, I looked around my modest living room filled with the quilts and embroidered linens I had made over the years. Every stitch held a memory of raising Daniel alone after his father's accident at the factory. The nights of worry, the mornings of hope, the endless sewing to keep the lights on. And today, all of that led here, to my son's wedding day. I picked up the gift I had prepared, a complete set of hand-embroidered sheets with their initials intertwined in gold thread. 2 months of work, every evening after finishing orders for clients. I'd sewn love into every stitch, but fate had a strange sense of humor that day. When I stepped outside, I saw firefighters blocking the main road. A water pipe had burst on Clover Lane overnight, flooding the whole avenue. My neighbor, Marge Hill, leaned out from her window shouting, "Evelyn, you can't drive out that way. Been shut since 5 this morning." My heart sank. The church was 15 blocks away, and my old sedan couldn't get through. I tightened my shawl and started walking, heels clicking against the wet pavement. 15 blocks in heels is no joke for a 67-year-old woman. By the time I reached the taxi stand, my dress hem was damp, my hands trembling from exhaustion. A cab finally stopped, the driver glancing at me through the mirror. "Downtown First Metropolitan Baptist?" I asked, voice tight. "Long way with the detour, ma'am," he warned. "Gonna cost ya." I nodded. "Just drive." The ride took forever, past neighborhoods I hadn't seen in years, past the edges of the city where the air smelled of asphalt and fried food. I kept checking my watch, whispering silent prayers that they hadn't started without me. But when we pulled up to the grand church steps, I already knew. The music had stopped. Guests were spilling out, laughing, hugging, tossing rice. I stood frozen by the taxi door, clutching the embroidered sheets like a lifeline. For a moment I thought I'd faint. Then I straightened my shoulders. My mother always said, if you can't walk proud, at least walk steady. I looked for the entrance to the reception hall. There were arches decorated with white roses, and I followed the sound of chatter toward the back garden. That's when I heard the voices. Young, bright, careless. "Thank goodness she missed the ceremony," one said. The words cut through the air like glass. It was Vanessa, my new daughter-in-law. "You know how she is," she continued. "Always talking about how hard it was raising Daniel alone, always making people feel sorry for her. Maybe it's better she only showed up now." Another voice giggled. It was her friend Kendra. "Oh, mothers-in-law, they love playing the victim. My mom says it's typical of older ladies who don't have much going on." And then a third voice, sharp and dismissive. "Candace. Plus, can you imagine what she would have worn? That old-fashioned stuff she sews herself? It's better this way. No poor mother-in-law drama." They laughed. 3 bright, educated women laughing at the woman who had spent her life stitching love into every seam. I froze behind a bougainvillea tree, my fingers gripping the wedding gift so tightly the paper crumpled. For a long moment I couldn't breathe. They were words meant to be private, thrown casually like feathers, but each one landed heavy in my chest. Old outfit. Sad stories. Poor mother-in-law drama. The dress I'd spent months saving for suddenly felt cheap. The memories I'd shared, the truth about my struggles, now sounded shameful in my own head. I had worked, sacrificed, and loved, and still in their eyes, I was something to be laughed at. But I didn't cry. I smoothed my dress, fixed my hair, and whispered, "You faced worse, Evelyn. Walk tall." Then I stepped out from behind that tree and entered through the front door of the ballroom, holding my gift high and my head higher. "Mom!" Daniel's voice cut through the noise, full of relief. He rushed over, hugging me tight. "God, I thought something happened. You missed the ceremony." I smiled, forcing warmth into my voice. "A water main burst, son. Roads were closed, but nothing could keep me from your wedding." Vanessa appeared beside him, smile polished but eyes uneasy. "Oh, Mrs. Carter, what a shame you missed the vows. They were just beautiful." I kissed her cheek lightly. "The important thing is you're married now. God bless you both." As I walked further into the room, I noticed how people looked at me. Some kind, others politely indifferent. I saw Angela, Daniel's sister, waving half-heartedly before turning back to her conversation. No one offered me a seat near the main table. I found a chair at the back among strangers, listening to the laughter of a world I no longer belonged to. When Daniel opened gifts, the expensive ones drew applause and long thank yous. When he unwrapped my hand-embroidered sheets, Vanessa gave a faint smile, muttered, "Thanks, Mrs. Carter," and placed them under the table. My hands trembled in my lap. It wasn't the rejection of a gift, it was the dismissal of everything I had ever been. That night, while the music played and couples danced, I realized something that made my heart ache and my spine straighten all at once. I was no longer. That night, when the music faded and the crowd began to thin, I told Daniel I needed to leave. "Already, Mom? It's still early," he said, distracted, his arm around Vanessa's waist as she chatted with her bridesmaids. "I've got an early morning tomorrow," I replied. "Orders waiting to be finished." He hugged me, but I could tell his mind was elsewhere. Vanessa leaned in and kissed my cheek politely. "Thanks for coming, Mrs. Carter. We'll see you soon." There it was again. Mrs. Carter. Not Mom, not Evelyn, just the polite distance of a stranger. When I stepped outside the ballroom, the night air hit my face like cold water. The taxi ride home was silent except for the sound of my own heartbeat. Atlanta at night can be beautiful. The city lights like gold embroidery on dark fabric. But that night it felt cold, empty, distant. I pressed the wedding gift box to my chest as if to keep my heart from breaking through my ribs. During the 40-minute ride back to Southside, I replayed every moment of the day in my mind. Vanessa's laughter behind the tree, Daniel's distracted smile, the empty seat beside me at dinner, the way my embroidered sheets were pushed under the table like an afterthought. Each memory was another small tear in the fabric of something I'd spent my whole life sewing together. When I got home, the house was dark and still. The smell of lavender from the candle I'd left burning lingered in the air. I placed the empty gift box on the kitchen table, sat in my rocking chair and stared at the wall. For years, that chair had been my refuge, the place where I embroidered baby blankets, wedding veils, curtains for neighbors, and even funeral linens. I'd poured my life into that chair. But that night, as I rocked gently back and forth, something shifted inside me. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, like the faint crack that appears in a glass before it shatters. For the first time, I saw my life without the soft blur of denial. I saw the sacrifices that had gone unnoticed, the affection that had turned into obligation, the love that had been taken for granted. I whispered to the empty room, "Maybe he doesn't need me anymore." The words sounded foreign, like they belonged to someone else, but as soon as I said them, I knew they were true. I remembered every night I'd stayed up sewing to pay for Daniel's private school tuition. Every birthday where I gave him the bigger slice of cake because we couldn't afford two. Every Sunday I'd spent cooking for him and Vanessa when they were dating, trying to make her feel welcome. And I remembered every time Vanessa had smiled, that careful, condescending smile. The kind you give someone you think is beneath you but you don't want to offend. "Why don't you buy more modern clothes, Mrs. Carter?" she once said. "Daniel can help you with that." Or, "Doesn't it bother you that people know you're still working at your age? Daniel's a professional now." Back then, I laughed them off, thinking she meant well. But now, in the quiet of my little house, I realized they weren't suggestions. They were warnings. Small, polite ways of saying, "You don't belong in our world." The clock ticked toward 3 a.m. I stood, went to the mirror, and looked at myself. The woman staring back wasn't the mother I thought I knew. She was older, smaller somehow, her hands rough and marked with years of needlework. The navy blue dress that had once made her feel elegant now looked tired. For decades I had defined myself by what I could do for others, for Daniel, for my clients, for neighbors, for the church. But what was left of Evelyn when no one needed her services? That night, standing in my worn slippers, I felt something inside me quietly shift from pain to clarity. I realized that love without respect slowly turns into servitude, and servitude, no matter how loving, erases the self. The next morning, I woke up at dawn out of habit. I brewed my coffee, poured it into my favorite chipped mug, and sat at the kitchen table staring at the sunlight creeping through the curtains. The house felt different, not emptier but quieter, as if it were waiting for me to make a decision. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my recent calls. Daniel's number was there, of course. For years, I had been the one to text first, to ask about his work, his meals, his weekends. That morning, I didn't. I set the phone face down. A small rebellion, but a meaningful one. Over the next few days, I decided to run a little experiment. I stopped calling Daniel to see how long it would take for him to notice. I stopped sending good morning messages or offering to bring over his favorite lemon pound cake. 8 days passed. On the 9th day, the phone rang. Daniel's voice was cheerful but hurried. "Hey, Mom, how are you?" "I'm fine, son," I said evenly. "That's good. Hey, listen, could you embroider some initials on my new shirts for work? Vanessa said you're the only one who does it right." He didn't ask how I'd been. He didn't mention the silence. He didn't even realize it had been more than a week since we spoke. He just needed something. "Sure, son," I said quietly. "Bring them by whenever you can." When I hung up, I stared at the phone for a long time. Once upon a time, that call would have made me happy. I would have felt needed, relevant. But now it just made me tired. That night, as I embroidered his initials, DC, fine gold thread on crisp white cotton, I began to stitch something else too. A new pattern, invisible but vital. A plan. Not a plan for revenge, not for drama or confrontation, but for rediscovery. For the first time in 30 years, I wanted to know what my life could look like if it wasn't centered around anyone else. I began to notice things I hadn't before. How my small house, though humble, was filled with beauty. The soft creak of the floors, the way afternoon light hit the lace curtains, the quiet hum of the sewing machine waiting patiently for me. I realized that I'd spent half my life keeping the house ready for visits that rarely came. Extra chairs for family dinners that never happened. A fridge stocked for guests who never arrived. The truth settled gently in my chest. I had built my home like a stage set for a family that existed mostly in my imagination. The following Sunday, I went to church alone for the first time in months. The choir sang Amazing Grace, and for the first time, I actually listened to the words. I once was lost, but now am found. I smiled. Maybe I was finding myself again too, slowly, painfully, but surely. After the service, Agnes Reed, a widow from the neighborhood, stopped me. "Evelyn, honey, how was the wedding?" she asked kindly. "It was beautiful," I said with a practiced smile. Agnes nodded, but her eyes lingered on me longer than usual. "You look tired, sweetheart, but there's something different about you too." I smiled faintly. Maybe I'm just learning to breathe differently. That evening, Marge Hill, my neighbor and oldest friend, came over with a pie. She took one look at me and said, "What's wrong, Evie? You've been quiet since the wedding." So I told her everything. The laughter behind the tree, the way Vanessa looked at me, Daniel's request that I stay away from their social events. Marge listened without interrupting, then took my hand. "I've seen this happen too many times, honey," she said softly. "Kids climb higher and forget the ladder that got them there. It doesn't mean they don't love you. It means they're ashamed of the climb." Her words hurt, but they rang true. I stared at the steam rising from my cup of tea and said, I just never thought I'd be the embarrassment in my own family story. Marge squeezed my hand. You're not, sweetheart. You're the foundation. But sometimes the foundation's buried deep, invisible, while the house gets all the praise. That night, after Marge left, I sat once again in my rocking chair. The gift box from the wedding still sat in the corner, empty but symbolic. I thought about the years I'd spent chasing pride through Daniel's achievements, trying to prove that my sacrifices had been worth it. And now, for the first time, I asked myself, what if my worth doesn't depend on anyone else's success? The thought felt dangerous, almost rebellious, but freeing. When the clock struck midnight, I whispered a promise to myself. On Monday morning, I brewed my coffee the same way I had for 40 years. Except this time, I poured just one cup. For decades, I'd always made two. One for me, one just in case Daniel dropped by, in case someone stopped for a chat, in case life remembered me again. But that morning, I realized I didn't owe a chair, a plate, or a conversation to possibilities anymore. The kitchen was quiet, but not lonely. It was mine. I took a clean sheet of paper and wrote at the top, things that belonged to me. Underneath, I listed them. Enroll in a computer class at the community center. Rearrange my house to fit the person I am, not the people I wait for. Open a savings account in my name, the Evelyn Fund. Visit Clara in Charleston. Make something beautiful that isn't a gift. Watch a movie I choose. Practice saying no thank you. When I set the pen down, the sound felt final, like a door closing softly on an old room. That afternoon, I began cleaning the living room. I carried the folding chairs, the 4 company ones, up to the attic. I dusted the china cabinet, cleared out the untouched candles, the polite gifts still in wrapping, the wedding photos of other people. Then, in one of the glass shelves, I placed a single thing, a sketchbook, blank except for the first page, where I'd drawn the outline of a new embroidery pattern. My hands trembled slightly as I wrote its title in pencil, Southside Light. I didn't know yet what it would be. I just knew it would be mine. The next day, I walked to the Southside Community Center and signed up for a class called Computer Basics for Seniors. The instructor, a cheerful woman named Carmen, greeted me with a bright smile. What would you like to learn, Mrs. Carter? She asked. I thought for a second. How to send a picture to my sister, I said, and maybe how to buy a bus ticket online. We'll get there, she said. You'll see, this isn't as hard as people think. There were 5 of us in class. Joyce, who wore floral scarves and laughed too loud. Patricia, who typed like she was playing the piano. Helen, who could read a font size from 10 feet away. We were strangers at first, but within an hour, we were all cheering whenever someone managed a double click without opening 3 windows at once. I wrote in my notebook, double click equals 2 tight stitches. Secure the thread. Don't pull too hard. By the time I left, I wasn't sure if I had learned computers or rediscovered rhythm. That evening, I opened the old wooden sewing box Charles had built for me when Daniel was little. Inside were bobbins, needles, and threads, hundreds of them, neatly coiled like small promises. I pulled out a deep cobalt blue spool, the same color as the dress I wore to the wedding. If that color had been a bruise, I was going to turn it into light. I stretched white linen across my embroidery frame and began the first outline, slow, patient, deliberate. Every stitch whispered, "You're still here." On Wednesday, I went to the bank. The teller, a young woman named Lila, smiled when I told her I wanted to open a new savings account. "What will you call it?" she asked. "The Evelyn Fund," I said. She laughed. "A fund for joy, then?" "Yes," I said. "For joy and for choice." She typed my name into the computer. When she slid the paperwork across the counter, I noticed my hand didn't shake. My signature looked strong, like it had been waiting years to reappear. That afternoon, I took a walk through Greenway Park, where the trees bent over the paths like old friends listening. On the far bench sat Beatrice, a woman I'd known for years from church, the kind who dressed in lavender and wisdom. "Afternoon, Evelyn," she said. "You look lighter." "Maybe I am," I said. "I've been carrying too many things that weren't mine." She chuckled softly. "The trick to aging, dear, is knowing what to put down before it drops you." We sat together in the stillness. The sky was a quilt of soft gray and sunbeams. When I went home, I didn't turn on the TV. I just sat in the quiet and let it fill the cracks. That night the phone rang. Vanessa. Hi, Mrs. Carter. My mom's hosting a little luncheon Saturday. Just the ladies. Would you like to come? Her voice was smooth, polite, the kind of voice that smiled with its teeth. I looked at the note on my counter. Saturday, computer class, farmer's market. Thank you, dear, I said, but I already have plans. A pause. Then, oh, all right, maybe next time. I hung up, leaned back, and smiled. It wasn't rebellion, it was a boundary, and for the first time it felt peaceful. The next morning, Daniel called. Mom, Vanessa said you can't make it Saturday. You okay? I'm fine, I said. Oh, good. I just thought you'd want to join. I will, when I want to, I said gently. Not because I feel I should. He hesitated. Right? Yeah, of course. It wasn't anger in his voice, more like confusion. Like hearing a new instrument in a familiar song. That evening, my neighbor Marge Hill came over with a peach cobbler. She looked around my living room and whistled. Girl, this place looks different. Did you redecorate or exercise? Maybe both, I said, laughing. I put the extra chairs away. Good. Those chairs were ghosts of old expectations. We ate cobbler and talked about my class, the blue thread, and the joy of saying no. Marge grinned. Every woman who learns to say no is secretly learning how to say yes to herself. Saturday came. I went to the farmer's market, walked among baskets of fresh peaches, handmade soaps, and threads dyed with turmeric and indigo. The woman behind the stall told me color holds memory. I smiled. Then I'll take a few new memories, please. When I got home, I sorted my threads like treasure. Sun, soil, sky, ocean. That night, the phone rang again. Daniel. Mom, Simone and her husband had to cancel their date. No babysitter. Could you watch the kids? I can't tonight, Daniel, I said. I already have plans. What plans? He asked, surprised. I'm taking myself to a movie. Silence. Then a slow, uncertain laugh. A movie? Yes, with popcorn and everything. Okay, have fun, Mom. The movie was about a Mexican widow learning to drive after losing her husband. I watched her grind the gears, take wrong turns, and laugh anyway. Somewhere in the middle, I realized, she wasn't learning to drive a car. She was learning to occupy her own life again. When I left the theater, I didn't feel lonely. I felt alive. Sunday, after church, Agnes Reed stopped me by the door. You look peaceful, Evelyn, she said. Did you do something new with your hair? Not my hair, I smiled. My soul. Agnes nodded. Good. Just don't make all your stitches the same. Even quilts need a bold thread. The following week, Carmen taught us how to send emails. Attach a picture, Mrs. Carter, she said. I took a photo of my unfinished embroidery and sent it to Clara, my sister in Charleston. The subject line read, Starting something new. Her reply came minutes later. Come see me. Stay as long as you want. For the first time in years, I booked a ticket without asking anyone's opinion. That evening, Vanessa called again. Mrs. Carter, Simone said she had to cancel her plans because you weren't available. I just hope there's no misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, I said calmly. Just better scheduling. Oh, well, okay then. After hanging up, I took out my navy blue dress from the closet. I laid it flat on the bed and ran my fingers along the hem. Then, I threaded a needle with golden yellow silk and began embroidering tiny dots of light, like lampposts on a quiet street. The dress that had once carried humiliation now carried forgiveness. Not for them, but for me. 2 days later, I bought a one-way bus ticket to Charleston. When the screen asked for a return date, I typed open. The system wouldn't allow it. I laughed and chose 1 week later. In my heart, I knew I'd come back when I was ready, not when the calendar told me to. That Friday, Daniel dropped by with a pile of shirts. He stopped in the doorway, looking around. Wow, Mom, the house looks different. It fits better now, I said. He smiled awkwardly. I wanted to say I'm sorry about the wedding. Vanessa was nervous. It wasn't fair to you. I nodded, still stitching. Nerves don't excuse cruelty, son. But apology accepted. He exhaled. Thanks. Listen, we're having a family dinner next week. No coworkers. Just us. Would you come? If it's because you want me there, yes, I said, eyes on the thread. If it's just to look right, then no. He didn't argue. He just nodded. Slow, thoughtful, like a man who'd finally heard the truth behind the words. That night, the phone rang again, this time from Linda Moore, Vanessa's mother. "Evelyn, dear," she began in that honey-sweet tone of Southern politeness. "Charles and I would love to have you over Friday night, just to get to know you better." I smiled into the silence. The old Evelyn would have rushed to say yes. The new one took a breath. "I appreciate the invitation," I said, "but I'm leaving for Charleston. Let's meet when I'm back, if it's truly for pleasure, not performance." Her pause was long but soft. "Of course, dear, for pleasure." When I arrived at the bus station, Marge hugged me tight. "Buy something in Charleston just because you like it," she said. "I will," I promised. "Maybe a silver thimble, to remember which finger deserves protection." The bus rolled out. Through the window, Atlanta shimmered behind me, its skyline stitched in gold against the dawn. My phone buzzed, a message from Daniel. "Have fun, Mom. I love you." 3 words, "I love you." Late, but right on time. Charleston smelled like salt, magnolia, and history. Clara hugged me so hard I felt years fall off my shoulders. "You look lighter," she said. "I put down what wasn't mine," I told her. That evening, we sat on her porch eating grilled flounder. The cicadas hummed. "So," Clara asked, "how's Daniel?" "He's learning," I said. "And so am I, that I can be happy without asking permission." 2 days later, at the artisan market, I found a vendor selling sweetgrass baskets. She pointed to the center of the weave and said, "You see this? The center holds everything. If you lose it, the whole basket falls apart." I nodded. I've been finding my center again. That afternoon, Daniel texted, "Mom, when you're back, Vanessa and I want to take you to an art studio. Fiber art, like your embroidery." "Sunday okay?" I smiled. "If I'm free and I want to, yes." He replied with a single red heart. On my last night in Charleston, Clara took me to a small performance by a textile artist named Jamal Henderson. He spoke about heritage, color, and thread. "Every stitch is a decision," he said. "You can't unstitch time, but you can choose the next color." I wrote that in the margin of my ticket. I already knew what my next color would be. When I returned home, I didn't rush to call anyone. I unpacked slowly, brewed mint tea, and opened my sewing frame. Then, deliberately, I called Daniel. "I'm home," I said. "Can't wait to tell you about Charleston and the sweetgrass woman." He laughed softly. "I can't wait either. And Mom, Vanessa found a textile circle downtown. She thinks you'll love it." For the first time, I heard sincerity, not duty, in his voice. "I'll come," I said, "because I want to." That night, I hung up the navy dress on the wall. Under the lamplight, the golden dots glowed like constellations. It wasn't the dress of a mother left behind. It was the uniform of a woman who'd returned to herself. Outside, Atlanta's skyline glimmered, thread and light in memory. Inside, I took one last stitch on my embroidery and whispered to the quiet room, "You can't unstitch time, but you can always choose the next color." And that color, the following Sunday, dawned clear and cool. Atlanta's air had that early fall softness, a warmth you could still taste, yet a chill that whispered change. I pulled on my navy dress, the one I had restitched into light, and stood before the mirror. The woman staring back at me wasn't the same one who had hidden behind a tree months ago. Her shoulders had steadied. Her eyes didn't ask for permission anymore. The downtown fiber studio was tucked inside a renovated brick building near Edgewood Avenue, its walls painted the color of cotton fields under sunlight. Carmen had kept her promise. She was there at the entrance, waving. "Welcome to the circle, Mrs. Carter," she said. "Or can I call you Evelyn now?" "You'd better," I smiled. Mrs. Carter is still figuring herself out. Inside, women of every age were bent over looms, threads glowing in jars like preserved rainbows. There was laughter, quiet, rhythmic, like wind chimes in unison. Carmen led me to a table where Helen, Joyce, and Patricia were already waiting. "Ladies," Carmen said, "meet the one I told you about, the woman who turns heartache into fabric." I blushed. "That's too generous. I just stitched to stay standing." Joyce grinned. "Honey, that's exactly why art exists." We worked for hours, sharing stories between the click of needles. I learned that Patricia was weaving a tapestry for her daughter's graduation. Helen was making a memory quilt for her late husband, and Joyce, ever the dreamer, was crafting an enormous phoenix. When they asked what I was working on, I held up my piece. A skyline of Atlanta, stitched in cobalt blue and gold. "Southside Light," I said. They leaned in, touched the fabric gently, and nodded with that unspoken understanding that women share when they recognize courage disguised as thread. At the end of class, Carmen announced an upcoming community exhibition titled Hands That Remember. "You should enter this," she said to me. "Oh, I'm not an artist," I replied automatically. She raised an eyebrow. "Then what are you?" I looked down at the golden threads shimmering under the studio lights and whispered, "Maybe I'm learning." That evening, Daniel came to pick me up. "You look great, Mom," he said, genuinely surprised. "Is that the same dress from—" "Yes," I interrupted, "but it tells a different story now." He smiled awkwardly. "Vanessa's making dinner, just us." The house smelled of rosemary and lemon. The table was small, intimate, no long rows of guests or loud music, just the three of us. For a while, conversation hovered over safe topics: the weather, Daniel's work, the city's new bike lanes. Then Vanessa set down her fork and looked at me. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. I froze. "For what?" "For that day at the wedding," she said. "I was nervous, and I said cruel things about you. You didn't deserve that." Her eyes were wet, but steady. "You're part of this family, Evelyn. Not because Daniel says so, but because I want you to be." For a moment, the air around the table felt lighter than it had in years. I reached across, took her hand gently. "Thank you, dear. Apologies are like threads, thin but strong when you pull them with care." Daniel exhaled, almost smiling. "Mom, Vanessa signed us up for the art studio fundraiser next month. They're inviting local artists. Carmen told us you're entering a piece." I raised an eyebrow. "News travels fast." Vanessa laughed. "Gossip in Atlanta beats Wi-Fi." We spent the rest of the evening talking about design ideas. Vanessa showed me photos of home interiors she decorated. Daniel admitted he'd been reading about community art grants. For the first time, we weren't mother and son or rivals for attention. We were simply three adults trading stories around a table. When I went home that night, I didn't feel like an outsider invited out of pity. I felt like a woman who had earned her seat. A week later, a letter arrived from Charleston, written in Clara's looping script. "Evelyn, I can hear your new voice in every message you send. Don't hide your light under politeness anymore. The world needs women who shine without permission. With love, Clara." I pinned the letter above my sewing table. Beneath it, I wrote my own note: "Shine without permission." Preparing for the exhibition became my quiet revolution. I worked every morning at the table by the window, letting sunlight pour across the fabric. Each section told a part of my story. The lower left corner was a patchwork of rough gray stitches, the years of struggle. The center glowed with gold, the awakening. And at the top, I embroidered 3 small figures under the skyline. One with silver hair, one tall in a suit, one graceful in a bright dress. When Carmen saw it, she asked, "Who are they?" "My family," I said. "The day we started again." She smiled. "Then you've already won." The community hall buzzed with voices and camera flashes. Rows of fabric art covered the walls, quilts, tapestries, woven dreams. When I saw my piece hanging among them, I felt an ache so beautiful it almost hurt. Southside Light shimmered under the warm lamps, the skyline of my city shining like forgiveness. Vanessa approached, holding Daniel's hand. "It's incredible," she whispered. "The colors, the texture. Look, Daniel, it's us." He leaned closer, eyes glistening. "It's beautiful, Mom." Then he said something that broke me in the gentlest way. "I'm proud of you." I had heard those words once before, but only when I did something for him. Now he said them because I had done something for myself. When the announcer called my name for the Community Choice Award, the applause washed over me like warm rain. I walked to the stage, my hands steady. In my short speech, I said, "Every stitch you see here came from a woman who thought she was finished, until she realized she was just changing patterns. We all carry threads of pain and threads of grace. The art is learning which ones to weave and which ones to let go." The room went silent for a heartbeat, then erupted in cheers. Vanessa hugged me afterward. "You were right," she said. "You can't unstitch time, but you can pick the next color." I laughed. I learned from the best: regret. Weeks passed, and my life began to move with new rhythm. Mondays were for the textile circle, Tuesdays for the park, Fridays for dinners. Sometimes with Marge, sometimes with Daniel and Vanessa, sometimes alone with a good movie and my thoughts. One morning, I found a small package on my doorstep, a silver thimble from Charleston. A note from Clara inside read, "For the finger that remembers to protect itself." I slipped it on my middle finger and smiled. It fit perfectly. Later that day, Daniel dropped by again. No shirts, no errands, no favors. "Just coffee," he said. We sat on the porch in quiet company, the kind that doesn't need filling. After a while he asked, "Mom, do you ever miss the old days?" "Sometimes," I said, "but only the parts where I didn't know my worth. Because once you learn that, you can't go back." He nodded slowly. "I think I'm learning that too." Vanessa joined us later, carrying a plate of lemon cake. She sat beside me and said, "We were thinking, would you teach me embroidery?" I blinked. "Really?" She nodded. "I want to learn the way you tell stories, not with words but with color." I laughed softly. "All right, dear, but I'll warn you, it's not the stitching that's hard, it's learning which mistakes to keep." We spent that afternoon under the porch light, threads crossing, stories weaving together again, this time on purpose, not by obligation. That night, when I finally turned off the lamp, I glanced at Southside Light hanging on the wall. The gold skyline gleamed faintly in the dark. And I realized something. The woman who once sewed to survive, morning light spilled across the room like warm silk. The first thing I saw was Southside Light, hanging proudly on the far wall, my skyline stitched in gold and blue. Once I had stitched in silence to keep from breaking. Now I stitched to speak, and the world had begun to listen. It was a Thursday when Carmen called. "Evelyn," she said, excitement bubbling through the phone. "The Art Council loved your piece. They want to feature you as a guest mentor for the new community program, teaching embroidery to women rebuilding their lives." I laughed softly. "Me? A mentor? You're exactly what they need," she said. "Someone who understands that healing is slow but beautiful." When I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long while, hands resting on the grain of the wood. I thought about all the years I'd felt invisible, the years when the only voice in the room was the hum of my sewing machine. Now someone was asking me to teach others how to find their voices again, through the same hum. The community workshop took place in a refurbished church hall. The walls were still marked by faint crosses where the paint had been scraped, as if the space itself remembered prayer. 10 women sat in a circle. Some were quiet, eyes cautious. Others laughed nervously, clutching their fabric like shields. There was Maria, a single mother escaping an abusive marriage. Lydia, whose son was serving time. June, who had lost her home in a fire and hadn't sewn since. I looked at their faces and saw pieces of myself in every one of them. I didn't start with instructions. I started with a story. "When I was a girl," I said, "my grandmother told me that life is a fabric. Sometimes we pull too hard and the thread breaks. Sometimes we stitch the wrong pattern and have to begin again. But the most beautiful quilts," I smiled, "are made from mistakes that learn to stay." The women smiled, a few through tears, and so we began. The sound of thread pulling through cloth filled the room like rain on an old tin roof. Every now and then someone sighed, laughed, or whispered, "I didn't think I could do this anymore." And every time they did, I answered, "You just did." When class ended, Maria stayed behind. She held up her half-finished piece, a field of tiny daisies on rough cotton. "They're uneven," she said apologetically. "Good," I told her. "So are real flowers." That weekend, Daniel and Vanessa came over for dinner. They brought a homemade casserole and something wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" I asked. "Open it," Daniel said. Inside was a framed photo of the three of us standing beside Southside Light at the exhibition. Beneath it, Vanessa had written in calligraphy, "The thread that mends us is love, stitched by time, sealed by respect." I touched the glass and smiled. "That's beautiful." "It's yours," she said, "because you taught us how to make something whole again." As we ate, Daniel told me about his new project, a youth mentorship program he'd proposed at work. "I think it's time I give back," he said. "I've learned that people don't grow from being managed, they grow from being seen." He glanced at me meaningfully. "You taught me that too." For a long while, we just sat. 3 people, 1 table, no apologies left between us. Later that night, after they'd gone, I sat on the porch with my cup of mint tea. The neighborhood was quiet, except for the hum of crickets and the distant rattle of a freight train. The same train I used to hear years ago while crying over bills and loneliness, back when life felt like a tunnel that would never end. Now it just sounded like rhythm. I looked down at my hands, at the faint scars and calluses that had once embarrassed me. They were my history, carved into skin. Every mark proof that I had survived something, created something, forgiven something. In the distance, the moon hung low, the same color as the silver thimble Clara had given me. I slid it onto my finger and whispered, "Thank you for protecting me even when I didn't ask." For a moment, I thought I heard Charles's voice in the wind, soft as the thread slipping through cloth. "You finally made something just for you." And I smiled. "Yes, love, I did." Weeks later, the Textile Circle hosted a small exhibit of our students' works. Maria's daisies had grown into a full meadow. Lydia had stitched a portrait of her son from scraps of denim. June embroidered the word home in looping gold script. When they stood beside their finished pieces, I felt the same pride I had once reserved only for Daniel. The kind of pride that comes not from possession, but from witnessing rebirth. During the closing remarks, Carmen introduced me as the woman who turned grief into gold. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my needle. But later that night, when I got home, I realized she wasn't wrong. I had alchemized pain, not by erasing it, but by threading it into beauty. Months passed. The world went on. Storms came, headlines changed, new people moved into the neighborhood. But my rhythm stayed. Mornings with tea, afternoons with thread, evenings with gratitude. One day, I began a new piece, a large tapestry, bigger than any I'd made before. I called it the Fabric of Grace. It wasn't just mine. It was stitched with pieces donated by others, scraps of denim from Maria, lace from Lydia, ribbon from Vanessa, a tie from Daniel, even a small patch of blue cloth Clara mailed from Charleston. In the center, I left a single square of untouched linen. When Carmen asked why, I said, "For what's still to come. The part of life not yet sown." The day it was finished, I hung it in the studio window. Sunlight poured through it, lighting up every uneven stitch like a constellation. Outside, people stopped to look. Some smiled, some cried, some just stood quietly, as if they could feel their own stories inside the fabric. That evening, as I locked the studio door, I turned back for one last glance. The tapestry glowed in the window, pulsing with the heartbeat of every woman who had ever believed she was finished, and then began again. I walked home slowly, the air sweet with magnolia and rain. When I reached my porch, I sat down, closed my eyes, and listened. Somewhere inside the house, the old sewing machine hummed, steady, familiar, eternal. And for the first time in my life, I realized it wasn't just a machine. It was me. Years will pass, threads will fade, fabrics will fray. But somewhere in Atlanta, a small embroidered skyline will still hang in a sunlit room. And if anyone ever asks about it, someone will say, "That was made by Evelyn Carter." Morning found me awake before the birds. I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the first pale ribbons of light slip between the blinds. The world outside was still, the kind of stillness that hums rather than sleeps. I thought of how for most of my life I'd chased noise, the chatter of family, the demands of love, the proof of usefulness. Now silence was the truest friend I had. It didn't need anything from me. It simply was, like breath, like time, like grace. The community center had grown since that first class. We now had shelves lined with donated fabrics, baskets overflowing with thread, and a corkboard pinned with photos of women holding up their finished work. Each piece told a story: recovery, forgiveness, courage. Carmen approached me one afternoon. "You've created something remarkable, Evelyn. They trust you." I smiled. "They trust themselves. I just handed them the needle." That week, I decided to start something new. A mentorship program called The Thread We Share. Once a month, my former students would teach beginners. We didn't grade, didn't judge, didn't compete. We just sat in a circle and let the rhythm of hands and hearts fill the room. Maria now taught color blending. Lydia, who once doubted herself, guided women through freeform stitching. June handled the welcome desk, her smile the first light every newcomer saw. One afternoon, I caught them laughing together, teasing each other about crooked lines and stubborn knots. For a moment, I simply stood there and watched. They didn't see me, and I didn't need them to. That was legacy enough. A month later, Daniel arrived at the studio with a box wrapped in brown paper. "Open it," he said, grinning. Inside was a new sewing machine, sleek, modern, painted a soft sky blue. On the metal plate, he'd had it engraved. "For Mom, who taught me that fixing doesn't mean hiding the seam." My throat tightened. "You didn't have to." "I know," he interrupted gently. "That's why it matters." We set it up together. The hum of the motor purred steady like the old one, but younger, braver, ready. When I pressed my foot on the pedal, it started like a whisper becoming a song. And in that moment, I felt time collapse, the past bowing to the present, both curving toward forgiveness. Weeks passed. Spring arrived with its patient green. Vanessa called one evening. "I have a surprise," she said. "Come by Sunday." When I arrived, her living room had been rearranged. A large oak table stood in the center, covered with fabrics, ribbons, and spools of thread. Around it sat 6 women, young mothers, professionals, students. "I started a stitching group," Vanessa said, her cheeks glowing. "You inspired me. We meet twice a month." She held up a small linen square embroidered with the words "Begin Again." I laughed, tears pricking the corners of my eyes. "Look at you, stealing my lines." She smiled, borrowing them, for the next generation. That night, as I left, she pressed a small pouch into my hand. Inside was a thread of gold, the same shade I'd used for Southside Light. "For your next story," she said. Summer brought Clara to Atlanta for the first time in years. She stepped off the train wearing her big straw hat and that same mischievous grin she'd always had. When she walked into the studio and saw the walls filled with color and cloth, she whispered, "Evelyn, you made a cathedral out of fabric." We spent a week together, cooking, laughing, attending the Sunday market. She sat in on one of my classes, watching as I helped a new student untangle her thread. "You found your ministry," she said later. "Ministry?" I chuckled. "I'm no preacher." "Maybe not, but you teach resurrection." That night we drank wine on the porch, the city lights shimmering beyond the trees. Clara looked at me and said, "You know, sis, you never stopped being a mother. You just changed who you were mothering. First Daniel, now the world." I thought about that for a long time after she left. As autumn crept in, I began working on what I knew would be my last great piece. A quilt for the community center. I named it the Map of Hands. Every student who'd ever passed through the studio contributed a patch. Maria stitched her daisies. Lydia embroidered a blue door, the symbol of freedom. June added the word home. Vanessa sewed a sunburst of gold thread, and Daniel, with a grin, sewed a single crooked heart in red. When it was finished, the quilt spanned the entire wall. From afar, it looked like a mosaic of color. Up close, it looked like a lifetime, flawed, beautiful, alive. At the unveiling, Carmen turned to me and asked, "What will you do now?" I smiled. "Rest, and maybe learn to let others sew without me hovering." She laughed. "Good luck with that." Now, on most evenings, I sit on my porch again, not waiting, just watching. The city hums like a lullaby. Somewhere down the street, children chase fireflies, their laughter echoing into dusk. In my lap lies a small piece of cloth I keep meaning to finish, but never do. It's not unfinished out of neglect. It's unfinished on purpose. Because not every story needs an ending sewn tight. Some need space to breathe. Sometimes Daniel visits after work. He brings coffee, sits beside me, and talks about his students, his garden, or nothing at all. Vanessa drops by with her stitching circle, their laughter spilling onto my porch. And occasionally, one of my former students passes by the gate, waving a bright scrap of fabric in greeting. Each of them carries a little piece of my thread, and that's all I ever wanted. One night after everyone had gone home, I stood alone in the studio. The lights were dim, but the quilts glowed faintly under the street lamps outside. I ran my fingers along the fabric of grace and whispered, "Thank you." Not to the fabric, to the woman who'd stitched it, to the girl I used to be, to the silence that taught me how to listen. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of something pinned to the bulletin board. A note in Vanessa's handwriting. "Evelyn Carter. The woman who taught us that mending is not weakness and that beauty lives in every visible seam." I smiled, locked the door, and stepped out into the cool night. The city breathed around me, neon and jazz and memory. Above, the moon hung full and forgiving. And as I walked home, I knew this truth in my bones. I had not merely survived my life. I had stitched it, one scar, one joy, one choice at a time, until it became art. Years from now, someone will find a quilt in an old studio, initials stitched into the corner, EC, Atlanta, 2025. They might trace the seams, wondering who she was. Maybe they'll ask, was she famous? And someone nearby will smile and say, no, she was something rarer. She was finished, yet never done. And the thread, my thread, will keep weaving. Winter came softly that year. Not the cruel kind that bites, but the gentle one that whispers rest into old bones. Atlanta looked different in the cold, slower, hushed, as if even the city were taking a breath between chapters. I had learned to love that pause. Every morning, I sat by the same window where Southside lights still hung, sunlight turning its golden skyline into fire. The colors had faded slightly, but somehow that made them more beautiful. Proof that beauty didn't need to shout to endure. It just needed to stay. On the table beside me sat a small wooden box, my memory chest. Inside were letters, photos, scraps of cloth, notes from students, sketches, bits of thread. A life told not through grand events, but through quiet evidence that I had once touched people and left warmth behind. Every Sunday, I wrote one letter to someone who had changed me. Not for reply, just to release gratitude into the world. That morning, I wrote to Marge. You were the first person to tell me that saying no was a kind of self-love. Because of you, I learned that boundaries are not walls. They are doors we choose who to open for. Then one to Carmen. Thank you for giving my hands a second language. And one last to Clara. You once said I was a mother who changed who she mothered. You were right. I have spent my life sewing people back to themselves. I sealed the letters, tied them with a strand of blue thread, and placed them inside the box. It wasn't for anyone else to find. It was just my way of saying, I lived. That afternoon, Daniel came by with his little daughter Maya. She was 5, bright-eyed and endlessly curious. Grandma, she said, tugging my sleeve, Daddy said you make stories with string. Can I see? I smiled, led her to my sewing table, and showed her the simplest trick, pulling a needle through a hoop of fabric. She gasped as the thread appeared on the other side. It's magic, I laughed. It is, sweetheart, but the real magic isn't the needle, it's what you imagine before you start. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching us. She's got your hands, he said softly. No, I replied, threading the needle again. She's got her own. I'm just giving her a color to start with. When they left, Maya hugged me tightly. Her little hands smelled like cinnamon and crayons. Bye, Grandma, she said. I'll make something for you next time. My throat tightened. I'll be waiting. After the door closed, the house felt full, not empty, as if their laughter still floated in the air, caught in invisible thread. That evening, I walked to the studio one last time. The lights were off, but moonlight filtered through the windows, bathing the quilts in silver. I touched the fabric of grace, tracing the stitches of each woman who had sat here before me. Some were gone now, moved to new cities, new lives. But their work, their fingerprints and thread, remained. I pinned one last note on the wall. Every stitch tells a story. Every woman leaves a color behind. Don't rush to finish. Some patterns are meant to unfold slowly. Then I turned off the lights, locked the door, and stood outside for a long time under the quiet Atlanta sky. It wasn't goodbye. It was completion. Back home, I brewed my tea and sat by the window. The night was clear. The city lights shimmered like tiny beads sewn onto darkness. I thought about all the colors that had guided me. The bruised navy of heartbreak, the tender gold of forgiveness, the soft white of peace. If I had to choose one color to leave behind, it wouldn't be bright, it would be warm. Because warmth, once given, never really fades. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and listened. To the hum of the world, the steady ticking of the clock, the faint rhythm of my own heart. Everything that had once hurt had turned into something else. Lesson, laughter, light. And I realized something I wished I'd known sooner. We are not measured by what we finish, but by what we begin in others. I looked at the thread still hanging from my last hoop, glinting under lamplight, unfinished, waiting. I smiled. Maybe that was how all lives should end, not tied off neatly, but left open, inviting someone else to continue the story. Outside, the moon hung like a thimble over the city, silver and kind. Somewhere a sewing machine hummed, not mine, not anymore, but familiar. The next generation was stitching, and I, Evelyn Carter, rested, finally, in the color that remains. Beautiful. Here is part 8, The Threads Between Stars, the eighth and final epilogue chapter of Threads of My Own. It runs about 5 pages in cinematic English prose, gentle, luminous, poetic. This part transcends Evelyn Carter's personal life. She becomes a quiet presence in memory, legacy, and art, a symbol of all women who rebuild themselves stitch by stitch. Tone, reflective, spiritual, deeply emotional, perfect as the closing act of a long-form story or film narration. Time is a quiet seamstress. She never asks permission. She simply works, threading days through nights, weaving seasons into years, turning moments into memory. When I was younger, I used to think time took things from us, people, beauty, chances. Now I understand. Time doesn't take. She folds, she keeps everything, every color, every thread, tucked safely between her pages. Years passed. The Southside Textile Studio eventually changed names. The walls were repainted, new machines replaced the old, and the next generation of women filled the room with new laughter. But the sunlight that streamed through those windows each morning remained the same, golden, patient, alive. One day, a young artist named Nora Bell was cleaning a storage closet when she found an old wooden chest. Inside, a few spools of thread, a silver thimble, and a folded piece of linen embroidered with a skyline. At the bottom corner were 2 initials, tiny but firm, EC. The label read Southside Light, 2025. Nora held the fabric up to the window. The light poured through the stitches, scattering gold onto her face. She smiled, feeling something she couldn't quite explain. A softness, a strength, a warmth. She brought it to her mentor, an elderly woman who had once been one of Evelyn's students, Maria. Maria's hands trembled when she saw it. "Oh," she whispered, "this was hers." "Who?" Nora asked. "The woman who taught us that thread can heal anything." Months later, the city hosted an exhibition celebrating women of Atlanta, makers and dreamers. Nora displayed Southside Light at the entrance, framed beneath soft white fabric. The description read, "Created by Evelyn Carter, a self-taught textile artist from Southside Atlanta, 1948 to 2028. Her work is a tribute to everyday resilience, proof that art can grow quietly in ordinary rooms and still change lives." Visitors paused before it. Some cried, some just stood still, their reflections merging with the golden skyline in the glass. A mother whispered to her daughter, "She made this with her own hands." The little girl asked, "Is she famous?" The mother smiled. "Not famous. Forever." That night, after the exhibition closed, Nora stayed behind to lock up. She turned off the lights, but before leaving, she noticed how the moonlight hit the fabric, just right, making the skyline shimmer like a city of stars. For a second, she imagined she saw the faint outline of a woman sitting by a window, head bowed over her work, a soft hum filling the air. "Thank you," Nora whispered to the empty room. A breeze stirred, just enough to make one golden thread lift from the edge of the frame, catching the moonlight. When it fell back into place, it glowed brighter, like an answered prayer. In Charleston, Clara grew older, her hands less steady, her memory fraying at the edges like old fabric. But every time she looked at the quilt Evelyn had made, the fabric of grace, she smiled. When visitors came, she always pointed to the center. "My sister made that," she'd say proudly. She taught people to sew, but really, she taught them to stay. In her final days, she asked that the quilt be donated to the Atlanta History Center. "It belongs," she said, "where people can still touch it." And so it was, displayed near the section on community art, with a small plaque that read, "Every stitch tells a story. Some stories are stitched to last forever." Sometimes, late at night, the city lights of Atlanta blend with the sky so seamlessly that you can't tell where earth ends and heaven begins. From above, maybe it looks like a giant quilt, streets and rivers and skylines all stitched together in light. And somewhere in that pattern, unseen but enduring, is the thread of one woman's life. A mother, a sister, a friend, an artist. A thread that once began in a small Southside kitchen, wound its way through love, pain, and redemption, and never truly ended. Because love, the kind that listens, forgives, and creates, doesn't unravel. It only changes color. If you stand quietly enough in that old studio, you can still hear it. The hum of a sewing machine, the laughter of women learning to trust their hands again, and somewhere beneath it all, a soft voice saying, "You can't unstitch time, but you can always choose the next color." And so the story goes on. From cloth to cloth, from heart to heart, each woman adding her own hue, her own rhythm, her own thread to the great tapestry of the world. And perhaps one evening, in another time, a little girl, maybe Maya, maybe someone else entirely, will sit by a window, thread a needle, and whisper to herself, "Grandma was right. It is magic." Then she'll pull the needle through the cloth, and somewhere, faint but certain, the stars above Atlanta will flicker just a little brighter. There comes a time when a woman no longer measures her life in years, but in colors. I have lived through navy blues of sorrow, golds of forgiveness, whites of peace, and now a translucent silver that holds them all. It isn't an ending. It's what happens when a story exhales. The old Southside house still stands. The magnolia tree out front blooms each spring, stubborn as memory. Strangers live there now, a young couple with a baby, laughter spilling from the porch every evening. Sometimes neighbors say they see a faint glow from the sewing room window late at night, like a lamp left burning. But the new owners insist they turn off every light before bed. Maybe it's just the moon, they say. Or maybe it's something else, a residue of someone who once stitched her dreams into the walls. At the Atlanta History Center, beside the Fabric of Grace, a volunteer once opened an old notebook that had been tucked between fabrics for decades. Inside, written in faded ink, were single lines, not diary entries, just small truths. Art is not about what you finish, but what you awaken. A heart is a needle, it hurts because it's meant to thread. Love is a pattern we never stop learning. Visitors read them aloud in whispers, as if afraid to disturb the air. Each line was a breath from the past, stitching itself quietly into the present. Years later, Maya, my granddaughter, grew into a young woman with curious hands and a calm soul. She studied art, but her teacher said her work felt different, like memory painted in thread. One summer, she returned to the Southside studio, now part of a community art collective. She sat at my old table, the silver thimble beside her, and began a piece she called The Unwritten Pattern. It was a map, not of places, but of people. Each section held a symbol, a door for Lydia, a sun for Vanessa, a skyline for Daniel, a single loose stitch for me. When asked what the loose stitch meant, she smiled. It's the part of the story that never ends. Sometimes when evening falls over Atlanta, a faint wind moves through the open windows of the studio. The threads hanging from the walls sway gently, brushing one another. Gold against blue, white against crimson, making a soft, secret sound. The caretakers call it the whisper. No one sees where it comes from, but those who've heard it say it feels like being remembered by someone you never met. If you listen long enough, beyond the hum of the city, beyond the noise of work and worry, you might hear me too. I'm there in the rhythm of a sewing machine, in the laughter of women learning to mend, in the steady patience of anyone trying again after breaking. You'll know it's me when you feel a small, sudden warmth in your chest, as if someone were gently reminding you, you can't unstitch time, my dear, but you can choose the next color. Someday, the threads of all our lives will meet, mine, yours, and everyone who ever dared to rebuild something beautiful from the torn. They will weave a pattern too large for any single pair of hands to finish, and when the last stitch is placed, the universe will look upon it and whisper, "This is what love looks like, visible and true." Until then, keep sewing, keep forgiving, keep choosing colors that feel like hope. Because what we leave behind, if